What if I told you that you didn't have to build a government in your fantasy world? Would you believe me? Would you think I'm crazy? Imagine a world without kings, without presidents, without tyrants. No castles towering over the common folk, no rulers dictating every aspect of their lives. Just people living freely, governing themselves. Today, I want to talk to you about anarchy and building an anarchist society in a fantasy realm. We'll explore what anarchy actually is, what it isn't, and how these societies could function, and what fantastical elements to introduce into these societies, and the plot lines they open up for the fantasy world builder to explore. So whether you're a writer, a reader, or just someone who loves a good story, welcome to Anarchy and Fantasy, another episode in the political fantasy series from Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. As always on this channel, I like to get some historical context out of the way first. Let's start with what anarchy is and where it comes from. To understand anarchy, you have to understand a little bit about Marxism. I know, my audience is predominantly American and they do not like the word Marxism or socialism. But we're talking about philosophies here today. So set aside your politics and let's talk about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who developed socialism in response to the incredible exploitation of working people by capitalists during the Industrial Revolution. And when I say incredible exploitation, I mean that children as young as 10 were being sent into coal mines and subjected to other exploitative behaviors. The Enclosures Act in Britain created an enormous class of very poor people who were driven off land that they had worked for centuries. They were forced into cities to work in factories under extremely unsafe conditions. Based on the treatment of these workers by those who owned the means of production, which Marx called the bourgeoisie, he predicted that the people, the proletariat, would rise up against the bourgeoisie and establish a communist state. To achieve this, Marxism basically says that revolutionaries should seize the means of production and the state itself, putting in place an interim worker state, a socialist government. This government would then transition into a free socialist state where a government would no longer be needed. Okay. Anarchists like Peter Kropotkin and Mikhail Bakunin criticized Marxism based on the means of the revolution. There was a great quote I read in my research that says, "If you transform a branch into a club, how can you expect it to flower and bear fruit?" This perfectly encapsulates the anarchist position. Their argument is that the means by which you transform the society matter. You cannot seize the state and expect it to vanish. It will not. You will simply replace one government with another. Their predictions were borne out in the creation of the USSR and the PCR. People in these countries did not suddenly become free. Instead, they became some of the least free places in the world because they replaced one type of government with another. Anarchists believe in educating people, particularly workers, so that they understand that self-governance, owning the means of production, and removing property rights are in their best interest. They advocate for a self-organized revolution without any revolutionary elite to force change. They believe in direct action like strikes to create this change. They also believe in praxis, which means you must practice what you preach. You cannot preach a society free of hierarchy and yet use hierarchy to achieve your goals. My research on this topic has been extremely interesting. Besides reading various books, I also consumed a lot of YouTube content, And I'll leave the link to a channel by Zoe Baker, which I found particularly enlightening, down below. Her explanations were very clear, and I advise them for anybody who wants to know more about anarchy. I finally drew the line under my own research when I found myself watching a debate between Zoe Baker and Vash, another bread YouTuber, about the merits of anarchists engaging in the electoral system. And that was the point where I realized, okay, hold on. I'm just doing research. I'm not actually an anarchist or a Marxist. So let me just go ahead and make my little fantasy and anarchy world building video. So here we are. Let's close this section out on what anarchy is with 5 core principles. 1. Rejection of hierarchical authority. Anarchists fundamentally oppose all forms of involuntary and coercive hierarchy, including the state, capitalism, and other forms of institutionalized power. According to anarchist philosophy, capitalism is antithetical to these principles because if you have people who own the means of production and people who work on the means of production, like a farmer and his farm hands, or a mine owner and the miners, this creates a boss-employee relationship which anarchists reject. So, the miner should also own the mine is a very simplified way of looking at their principles. 2. Self-governance and voluntary cooperation. Anarchists believe that individuals and communities should govern themselves without rulers. They advocate for a society organized through voluntary cooperation and mutual aid. They believe that people can work together freely and meet their needs, and that social organization should arise naturally from the bottom up rather than being imposed from the top down. 3. Direct action. Anarchists promote direct action as a means of achieving their goals. This includes strikes, protests, and other forms of resistance that directly challenge existing power structures without relying on intermediaries like politicians or bureaucrats. They would implement direct democracy, not indirect or parliamentary democracies. An anarchist council might have representatives if the society were big enough to require it, but those representatives would never have decision-making power. Any proposals would return to the people who are represented, and those people would make the decision. 4. Individual freedom and autonomy. Anarchists place a high value on individual freedom and autonomy. Anarchists argue that true freedom can only be achieved when individuals are free from oppression and exploitation, allowing them to fully develop their potential in harmony with others. And 5. Decentralization and self-management. Anarchists favor decentralized forms of organization, where power is distributed horizontally rather than vertically. They advocate for self-managed communities, workplaces, and institutions where decisions are made collectively and democratically by those directly affected by the decision. So how this would work in practice, let's say a group of anarchist parents have children who need education. These parents would come together, discuss the merits of various schooling systems, and choose one. If there were a fundamental disagreement among the parents, they would split off, try different schooling systems, and whichever one had the better societal outcome would prevail. The principle of anarchic society is that they are always in motion. Anarchists don't predict what exactly a future anarchic society would look like. They state the principles of anarchy and say that the means to reach these principles must match the principles themselves. You cannot use an ends justify the means approach with anarchy. You must act in accordance with anarchic principles to reach the desired state. And they believe that people who live in an anarchic society must determine what that anarchic society looks like. Okay, so that's what anarchy is and a very brief overview of its history. If you're an anarchist, let me know in the comments if you think I fairly represented the anarchist position and history. If you're not an anarchist, let me know what you think of anarchy. And now, let's talk about some historical examples. Bet you didn't think that was possible, but there have been two notable implementations of anarchic societies. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, anarchist communities arose in Spain. This is one of the most significant examples of an anarchist principles being implemented on a large scale. Now, you need to understand that the Spanish Civil War was a very complex conflict. It pitted Republicans, a coalition of leftist groups, including anarchists, against the nationalists led by General Francisco Franco. Amid the chaos, the anarchists seized the opportunity to implement their ideas, particularly in Catalonia. The capital of Barcelona became the epicenter of the anarchist revolution. Anarchist principles were applied to various sectors, including agriculture, industry, and services. Land and factories were collectivized, and workers took control of production. In rural areas, collectivization often involved voluntary pooling of land and resources. They implemented direct democracy as a decision-making process. There were workers' assemblies and committees to manage the day-to-day operations of the collectives, ensuring that all members had a voice in decisions. The principle of mutual aid was central to the functioning of these communities. Resources and services were shared, and efforts were made to ensure that everyone's basic needs were met. Despite the lack of experience and self-management and the pressures of war, many communities successfully reorganized production and maintained social order. They demonstrated that large-scale anarchist organizations were possible, at least in the short term. However, the anarchist communes faced significant challenges. They had to contend with the ongoing civil war, opposition from the nationalists, and political tensions with other factions within the Republican side, including the communists, who of course favored centralized control. The relationship between the anarchists and other Republican factions, particularly the communists, was filled with tension and conflict because of this. These internal disputes weakened the anarchist movement, and ultimately, the victory of Franco's nationalists led to the suppression of the anarchist movement. The Franco regime dismantled the collectivist enterprises and restored private property and centralized control. Nonetheless, the Spanish anarchist communes remain one of the most significant attempts to implement anarchist principles on a large scale. They provide a historical example of how anarchist ideas can be put into practice, as well as the challenges they face. For the second example, let's turn to Ukraine. During the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923, an anarchist approach was taken in Ukraine. This period saw the establishment of the Free Territory in southeastern Ukraine from 1918 to 1921. The Ukrainian insurgent army, also known as the Makhnovists, because of their leader Nestor Makhno, was formed to defend this territory. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can an anarchist army even exist? An army is hierarchical by its very nature. And yes, that's true, but the Makhnovists showed how you can implement even something as hierarchical as an army without compromising the core of your principles. The army operated on principles of voluntary participation and democratic decision-making. Soldiers had the right to elect their officers and to participate in councils that decided military strategies. This ensured that leadership was accountable and had the consent of the soldiers. The Makhnovist movement emphasized mutual aid and collective defense, with a strong focus on preventing any form of exploitative hierarchy. Officers were subjected to the same conditions as ordinary soldiers and could be recalled by their units. This structure helped maintain equality and prevented the rise of a separate, privileged military class. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks emerged as victorious in the Russian Civil War, and as we saw with the Spanish Revolution, communists ain't necessarily the same as anarchists, and they reasserted control over Ukraine by 1921. However, the Free Territory provides a good example of anarchist principles in practice with no form of centralized government. It demonstrates that it is possible to create such a society even without fantastical elements, and it gives us a blueprint for how these societies might defend themselves against hierarchical-driven foes. What do you think of these historical examples? Have you ever heard of them? They were new to me until I researched this video, so let me know in the comments if they're new to you too. Now, I said that you can build these anarchist society without fantasy. But what fun would that be? So let's leave behind our world and discuss how the fantastical elements of world building might integrate with anarchism. Fantastical elements like your magic system, sentient species, civilization structures, or even your geographical features can either help or hinder the creation of an anarchic society. Let's explore each of these, starting with magic. Magic could empower individuals and small communities, reducing the need for centralized authority. If everyone has access to some form of magic, it could democratize power and resources, supporting anarchist principles. This is especially relevant in defense. Small communities could use magic to defend themselves without needing a standing army, allowing for voluntary, decentralized defense systems. Magic could also aid in self-sufficiency. Communities might produce food, heal injuries, and create goods without relying on external sources, helping to maintain independence and mutual aid. Magic could enable direct democracy and mutual aid, especially if it enhances communication through methods like telepathy or enchanted devices. In science fiction, advanced technology could provide similar benefits, such as instant voting mechanisms for distributed communities. But magic isn't just roses and awesome in this situation. It could also hinder anarchy. If magic is rare or controlled by a few individuals, it could lead to the concentration of power and the rise of elites, undermining anarchist ideals. This could result in a magocracy, which is very antithetical to anarchy. And check out the information card for my views on magocracies. Communities might also become dependent on powerful magic users for protection and resources, eroding the principles of mutual aid and self-sufficiency. Instead of helping each other, they turn to the wizard in the tower, creating a dependency relationship that evolves into hierarchy. Next, let's chat about living fantastical elements. Intelligent creatures like dragons, fairies, or sentient plants can become allies in anarchy, supporting communities through mutual aid and cooperation. This diversity could strengthen the community's resilience and adaptability. Different species might have unique skills and resources to share, fostering interdependence and mutual support. Alternatively, these species could be anarchist in nature and form the educational base for the working population of humans. For example, a fairy or draconic species that operates on anarchic principles could teach humans through cultural exchange how to be an anarchic society. Again, of course, they can also hinder the growth of an anarchic society. Imagine dragons simply imposing their will on humans. They would obviously then be an elite that fire breathes their way through the poor, struggling anarchic societies. So consider that side of the coin as well. So that's fantasy elements that are living and breathing. But let's take a look at geography and fantastical resources and how that might influence anarchy. Natural barriers like rugged landscapes or magical barriers can provide protection against invasion, helping maintain autonomy and independence for an anarchic society. One of the primary threats of an anarchic society is invasion, due to its weakness in organizing a hierarchical military. Sure, the Ukrainians in the revolution overcame this weakness, but it remains a challenge. Natural or magical barriers could help mitigate this threat and enabling the anarchic society to defend themselves. Fertile lands or rich natural resources can support self-sufficient communities. Magical resources could enable an anarchic society to remain independent and to provide mutual aid to their fellow anarchist communes. However, extreme isolation or harsh landscapes can hinder anarchy. Reduced communication and cooperation between communities can weaken the broader network of mutual aid, or limited resources can create competition and conflict, undermining communal harmony and mutual aid. So you can integrate those fantastical elements into your anarchy, either as something that helps the anarchic society by leaning into their principles, or as something that suppresses anarchy by putting in place barriers to anarchy. And if you enjoyed this exploration of fantasy and anarchy, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about potential plot lines for anarchic societies in fantasy. The first potential plot line I want to discuss is the effect of resource scarcity. And the best example of this is Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed. In The Dispossessed, we are introduced to Anares, a society that follows the philosophy of Odinism, which is essentially anarchism. Anares is supposed to be a hierarchyless civilization, but bureaucracy and red tape and hierarchy have crept into it due to resource scarcity. The protagonist, Shevek, finds his research blocked by a jealous bureaucrat, and then further delayed when he has to do manual labor to help ensure Anares' survival through a drought. Despite the society's anarchist ideals, resource scarcity necessitates some form of centralized resource allocation, which leads to frustrations and a lack of self-realization for individuals, in addition to creating hierarchies who decide who needs to do what work when. This plotline explores what happens to an anarchist society when it faces limited resources. The society must make difficult decisions about resource distribution, and people may find that their desires are not prioritized. Due to this resource scarcity, compromising the principles of anarchism might be seen as necessary, and so hierarchy begins to creep back into the society. This scenario highlights the challenges of maintaining anarchist principles in the face of practical constraints and the potential for bureaucratic creep even in a society that strives to avoid hierarchy. The second plotline I want to address also involves internal conflict within the society. Imagine someone from an anarchist society who has spent time in a capitalist society or has fallen out of step with the anarchist ideals. When they return to their home society, they become a counter-revolutionary, advocating for private property and claiming that the marketplace provides a better way to distribute resources. This creates a conflict where freedom of thought directly clashes with the core principles of the anarchist society. This scenario raises critical questions about the limits of freedom within an anarchist society. How far can freedom of expression go when it threatens the foundational principles of the community? Should the society tolerate ideas that aim to dismantle its very structure, or should it protect its core values, even if that means restricting certain freedoms? This type of conflict delves deep into philosophical questions about the nature of freedom, the nature of anarchy and capitalism, and it makes a compelling plotline for the exploration in fantasy or science fictions. The third plotline involves an external threat, an invading army approaching the anarchist society. This scenario always creates a compelling conflict in a fantasy world, but in an anarchist society, it raises unique questions about whether the ends justify the means and how closely society will adhere to its principles. Organizing a hierarchical army within an anarchist framework is inherently challenging. For instance, the society must balance the need for soldiers to recall their officers with the necessity for officers to make tough, immediate decisions. This tension between maintaining anarchist principles and effectively defending against a hierarchical military force creates a rich conflict. Exploring this plotline allows for a deep examination of the decisions the anarchist society must make to defend itself. It poses questions about the balance between ideological purity and practical survival, making it a fascinating avenue for storytelling in a fantasy or science fiction setting. And if you enjoyed exploring those three plotlines, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about 5 key attributes you need to consider when building an anarchy-based society in a fantasy world. 1. Social organization and decision-making. Think about how decisions are made in the absence of a central authority. An anarchist society often relies on direct democracy or consensus-based decision-making. Consider how community meetings or assemblies function, how disputes are resolved, and how various opinions are balanced. Define the roles individuals play within the society. In an anarchist system, roles are often fluid and based on skills and interests rather than hierarchical positions. Describe how tasks are distributed and how leadership, if it exists, is voluntary and temporary. And don't forget about magic and fantastical creatures here. Maybe every leader has a spell placed on them, so that they are constantly reminded that they are just mortal and this leadership position will end and they'll go back to the farm and be just a person again. 2. Economics and resource distribution. Anarchist societies typically emphasize mutual aid and cooperative economics. Think about how resources like food, shelter, and tools are shared and distributed. How are needs met without money or centralized control? Consider systems like bartering, communal ownership, or gift economics. Evaluate how the society sustains itself. Does it focus on self-sufficiency, with communities growing their own food and making their own goods? Consider how this impacts trade, technology, magic, and relationship with neighboring societies. 3. Culture and social norms. Anarchist societies are often built on strong cultural values such as freedom, equality, and solidarity. Define the cultural norms that support these values. How do these ideals influence daily life, customs, and traditions? Think about how the society educates and socializes its members. Without formal institutions, learning might be community-based and experiential. Consider how knowledge is passed down and how children are taught the values of society. Again, this is a good place for magic or other fantastical elements, with children potentially being educated through a magic device or perhaps a fantastical creature. 4. Conflict resolution and justice. Anarchist societies tend to favor restorative justice over punitive measures, so rehabilitation rather than retribution. Describe the mechanisms for resolving conflicts and addressing harm. How does the community facilitate dialogue and restitution and reconciliation? Consider how the society maintains accountability without traditional law enforcement. How are rules agreed upon and enforced? What happens when somebody repeatedly harms others or violates communal agreements? And 5. External relations and defense. Define how the anarchist society interacts with neighboring communities, especially those with different governance systems. Are there trade relationships, alliances, or conflicts? How does society protect its autonomy and its values? Think about how the society defends itself from external threats. Without a standing army, defense might rely on voluntary militias or community defense groups. Consider how this impacts the society's sense of security and preparedness for conflict. And again, don't forget about magic and other fantastical and geographical elements here, as we discussed in the earlier section. My goodness, this has been quite a long journey and video. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of anarchic philosophy and how you can implement it in a fantasy world. My next video in this series on politics in fantasy will take a completely different turn, and we will discuss how to choose a king. So make sure you're subscribed for that. As always, this series is brought to you by the wonderful members of my channel like Tony, Katie, Dylan, and Tiffany, who are all self-governing masterminds. And they have had access to the video about how to choose a king for some time now. And if you would like to join their glorious ranks and gain early access to my videos, along with all these other cool perks, hit the big join button down below. But please don't feel pressured to support my channel financially. You can also support the channel just by watching another video. Since you enjoyed this video enough to stick it to the end, you might consider watching my video on implementing philosophy as spiritualism in a fantasy world. Or you could trust the algorithm's recommendation for the next video to watch, and I will see you soon for another video from Just in Time Worlds, where we build what we need when we need it.